Not all stuck-up theology nerds are Presbyterian, but all Presbyterians are stuck. Hey guys, welcome back to KingdomCraft, where we build churches in Minecraft while talking about Christianity. And today I'm going to talk about the difference between Presbyterian and Reformed, because I am both Presbyterian and Reformed. To put it simply, all Presbyterians are Reformed, but not all Reformed people are Presbyterian. It's sort of like the tortoise-turtle rule, where all tortoises are turtles, but not all turtles are tortoises. Or if you prefer, the square-rectangle rule, where all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares. So yeah, all Presbyterians are Reformed, but not all Reformed people are Presbyterian. Now, a lot of you might be thinking, yeah, I'm Reformed and I'm not Presbyterian, I'm a Reformed Baptist. That's not what I'm talking about. Historically, Reformed Baptists have not been considered Reformed, because it's a very modern thing to define Reformed as just like a set of ideas, usually about predestination, maybe about covenant theology or something. But no, historically, Reformed Baptists are not Reformed, because the Baptist branch of the Christian family tree is just a different branch from the Reformed Calvinistic branch. Baptists don't come from the mainstream magisterial Reformation the way Reformed people do, and Reformed includes Presbyterians, but not just Presbyterians. So yeah, Reformed Baptists are not Reformed. Glad we can be clear about that. And the reason that is because according to the Reformed confessions, according to all the Reformers, the marks of a true church are pure preaching of the word and pure administration of the sacraments, and for all the Reformers, pure administration of the sacraments includes infant baptism. So even if a Baptist church is hypothetically Reformed on many issues, usually when a Baptist church calls themselves Reformed or Calvinist, they're only really Reformed on predestination. They believe in predestination and the 5 points of Calvinism, but nothing else. Sometimes they might be Reformed on some other issues. Maybe they'll adopt like a Reformed view of Christology or theology proper, or maybe even believe the London Baptist Confession, which has something resembling a Reformed view of the covenants. Not quite, but it's similar. But even so, if you don't believe in infant baptism, you're not Reformed. Because the Reformed churches were very strict about having right views of the sacraments. They treated the sacraments as just as essential as what you believe about salvation. So if you don't have a Reformed view of the sacraments, which includes infant baptism, it also includes believing in real spiritual presence, where we really receive the body and blood of Christ in the Lord's Supper, then you're not Reformed. I'm sorry. Anyway, but this isn't going to be a Baptist bashing video. I don't have any problem with Baptists. I just don't like when they try and claim to be Reformed, because they're not. But I'm not going to be talking about Baptists. I'm going to be comparing Presbyterians with other non-Presbyterian Reformed groups. Because Presbyterians are Reformed, but there are, indeed, Reformed people who are not Presbyterian. So it's a bit complicated, because the name Presbyterian refers to the church government structure that we have. Presbyter means elder in Greek, so a church with a Presbyterian government structure is a church run by a council of elders. It's called the session. It's a council of elders. So Presbyterian doesn't technically refer to our theology, it refers to our church polity. Polity is like, the politics, how the church government is run. Whereas Reformed refers to our theological tradition. So when I say I'm Reformed and I'm Presbyterian, it means I hold to Reformed theology, and my church has a Presbyterian form of church government. However, there are churches that hold to Reformed theology, but don't have a Presbyterian form of government. One example, the biggest example, is probably Congregationalists. Congregationalists differ from Presbyterians in that they think every church congregation should basically be independent, and Presbyterians don't think that. Presbyterians think that all church congregations should be subject to a higher authority, which is a presbytery, and even these presbyteries ideally should be subjected to like the higher authority of like synods or a general assembly. So basically that means there's accountability in the church, where we don't let each congregation just do its own thing however it wants. We're not independents. So Congregationalists are Reformed in their theology traditionally. Like most of the Puritans were Congregationalists. Not all, but most of the Puritans were Congregationalist. Especially the New England Puritans. Those guys, the Pilgrims who sailed over to America, and that's where we get Thanksgiving from. Those guys, yeah, they were all legitimately Calvinist. They departed from traditional Calvinist theology in a few ways here and there, but we can still call them Calvinists. They still baptized their babies and all. But they were Congregationalists. They were Calvinist, but not distinctively Presbyterian. There's also Reformed Anglicans. Not everyone in the Anglican or Episcopalian tradition holds to Reformed theology, but a lot of the original ones did, especially Thomas Cranmer, who's like the theological father of the Anglican tradition. And to this day, there's various streams of Anglicanism. I joke that that it's difficult to understand what Anglicanism is, but don't worry because they don't understand it either. There is more Reformed Anglican streams, and there are also more Catholic, Anglo-Catholic streams. So there are Reformed Anglicans, but obviously they don't have a Presbyterian government structure. They have an Episcopal government structure. Episcopal government refers to bishops. Episkopos means bishop. So their government structure is sort of like a monarchy. It's very top-down. It's like, to have a valid church, you need the church to have a priest who is appointed by a bishop, and the bishops all have apostolic succession going all the way back to the apostles. So yeah, those are two examples of different government structures, but still within the Reformed tradition. There's Reformed Anglicans and Congregationalists. And generally in early America, the early American English colonies, the main three denominations were all Calvinist, but had different church government structures. Like, the main religious options, if you were in colonial America, were, do you want to be Presbyterian, Episcopalian, or Congregationalist? They were all basically Calvinist, but they had different church government structures. And the reason that in Britain the denominations were named after their church polity is because in the British Reformation, everyone kind of agreed they wanted to be in the Reformed Calvinist tradition. And I'm using the words Reformed and Calvinist interchangeably here, because Reformed is what we historically called ourselves, and Calvinist is what the Lutherans called us, referring to Calvin's view of the Lord's Supper, actually. The word Calvinist originally had nothing to do with predestination. So tell that to anyone who thinks they're Reformed or Calvinist just because they have a Calvinist view of predestination. But anyway, in the British Reformation, everyone mostly agreed that they wanted to be part of the Reformed theological tradition. So then the debate was just, what kind of church government should we have? So that's why the Calvinist denominations emerging from Britain are named after their church government. That's why we have Episcopalians, and we have Congregationalists, and we have Presbyterians that are all called those things. However, Calvinists in continental Europe just weren't debating church government that much because they had to debate theology more. Because the Reformation in Europe was not unilateral. The main two sides in the European Reformation were the Lutherans and the Reformed, or Calvinists. The Lutherans called us Calvinists because they're accusing us of worshiping Calvin or whatever. They didn't call themselves Lutherans either. They called themselves evangelical. But we called them Lutherans, they called us Calvinists, and the name kind of stuck. So in Europe, the churches were too busy debating the different theological positions to really have time to debate their different church polity. So that's why if you meet like a continental European Reformed person, they're just going to call themselves Reformed, and those churches just call themselves Reformed. So you have the Dutch Reformed churches, and the Swiss Reformed churches, and the Hungarian Reformed churches, and they don't all have the exact same type of church government. Like, the Hungarian Reformed churches are a bit more Episcopal in their style of church government, and the Swiss Reformed churches are a bit more low church, maybe a bit more in the Congregationalist direction, but they don't really care because they're busy debating theology. They're busy debating theology with the Lutherans. And that's why, if you read writings from the period of Protestant scholasticism, like the 1600s, that's like the golden age of Protestant theology. If you read Dutch Reformed theologians, they talk a lot more about abstract theology. And if you read Presbyterians, they talk more about putting it into practice. And the historical context for that, the historical reasoning behind that, is the European Calvinists were busy defending their theology contra the Lutherans, so that is just naturally what they ended up writing about more. But the Presbyterians, they had already gotten most of the theology settled. They had to debate practice, how you actually do worship. They had to debate that with both the Congregationalists and the Episcopalians. So they ended up debating, where did all my cows go? Is that just lag? Oh yeah, here are my cows. There's just lag. The Presbyterians ended up debating, church polity and worship structure and all that more. So that leads to what I would say is the only real fundamental distinction between Presbyterians and other Calvinists is that Presbyterians are a lot more strict about how worship should go. Presbyterians tend to be more strict about what's called the regulative principle of worship. And the regulative principle of worship was really implemented in response to a lot of Anglicans, because a lot of the Anglicans and Episcopalians kept reintroducing Roman Catholic practices into worship. So the regulative principle of worship says if an aspect of worship is not in the Bible, we shouldn't do it. So that's why Presbyterian churches historically don't have any images of Christ or any images of God, because an image of Christ is an image of God. And I know everyone's going to say, oh, but I saw a Presbyterian church in my town. It has a picture of Jesus. Yeah, a lot. Churches of every denomination will often ignore the historic views of that denomination. There was a poll like 70% of lay Catholics don't believe in transubstantiation. And as we know, a lot of Presbyterians abandon traditional Presbyterian views. But traditionally, before like the 1890s, Presbyterian churches would never have any images of Christ. They would follow that more strictly. And traditionally, Presbyterian churches were strict about only singing psalms by practicing exclusive psalmody. And while I myself am not yet sold on exclusive psalmody, and only singing psalms and not singing any uninspired hymns, I appreciate that the Presbyterians were historically so careful to worship according to Scripture and not according to man-made traditions, especially ones that are outside the bounds of Scripture. So even though I might not appreciate how the regulative principle was applied, I do fundamentally affirm the regulative principle. And another way in which Presbyterians focus more on like actual practice than the other Reformed denominations is that while I will admit there's less theological content from distinctively Scottish Presbyterians than there is from Dutch Reformed theologians, there's way more, practical sermons and stuff. Presbyterians preach the best sermons. If you listen to a Tim Keller sermon, or even a sermon from your average PCA Presbyterian church, or from, Samuel Rutherford in the 1600s, those sermons are absolute bangers. Presbyterians preach the best sermons by far. So one difference in tendency between Presbyterians and other Calvinists is that while some other Calvinists, like the Dutch Reformed, might focus more on abstract theology, Presbyterians will focus more on, preaching and practical theology and stuff. Now, it's funny because when compared to other people like Baptists, Presbyterians are stereotyped as like the hyper-intellectual nerds. But when compared to the Dutch Reformed, Presbyterians are actually sort of like the dumb jocks of the group. Like the Scotsmen, because Presbyterians from Scotland, the Scotsmen aren't quite as academic as those nerdy Dutch Reformed theologians like, Wilhelmius van Diper. But Presbyterians are a lot more invested in practical theology and preaching and things like that. Another thing about Presbyterians, I think this might be like the one actual on-paper theological distinction between Presbyterians and other Calvinists. Presbyterians are uniquely strict about the Sabbath. Presbyterians, and obviously maybe Congregationalists as well, I'll grant Congregationalists this, but Congregationalists barely exist anymore in the modern world, and I'll get to that in a second, and that's part of our criticism of Congregationalism. Presbyterians historically way more strict about the Sabbath than anyone else. Presbyterians are one of the few groups that believe the Sabbath still exists, and it's specifically Sunday. You'll have a lot of people who say the Sabbath is Saturday, but the Lord's Day is Sunday. Some people who say we still should follow the Sabbath because it still applies to us, but they would say it's Saturday. That's what the Seventh-day Adventists think. And a lot of Baptists and evangelicals will say, like, oh no, Christ is our Sabbath. We don't need to follow the Sabbath anymore. Presbyterians are the ones who say the Sabbath still exists and it is specifically Sunday. And I wouldn't say Dutch Reformed theologians would deny this, but Dutch Reformed people have generally been a lot less strict about the Sabbath than Presbyterians. So Presbyterians follow a lot of the Scottish Covenanter principles, such as a strict insistence on Presbyterian government rather than the more continental Reformed flexibility on church government, a strict application of the regulative principle, more of a tendency to sing psalms rather than uninspired hymns, and also more of a tendency towards a cappella worship, singing just with the voice and not with any musical instruments. I mean, I love church organs, but if enforcing a cappella singing means there's no more CCM, no more contemporary music with guitars and drums, I am all for it. And I don't necessarily hold to all the most strict Scottish Covenanter principles. The only denomination today that really does hold to all of them is the RPCNA, but what it shows is the tendency of Presbyterians to be a lot more strict about how worship is done. Now, if there are any abstract theological distinctions, I will say that in general, it seems the Dutch Reformed scholastics from the 1600s are more Thomist, and the Presbyterians are more Scotist. It's just a tendency. You can find counterexamples to both. But the most famous Presbyterian scholastic, the most important Scottish Presbyterian Westminster divine, was Samuel Rutherford, and he was a hardcore Reformed Scotist. For those of you who don't know, a Scotist is someone who follows the philosophy and metaphysics of medieval theologian John Duns Scotus, and a Thomist is someone who follows the metaphysics of Thomas Aquinas, and there have been Reformed Thomists and Reformed Scotists. Francis Turretin is a very hardcore Reformed Thomist, and he's one of the most well-respected Reformed scholastics of all. So most Dutch Reformed theologians tend to be a bit more Thomist. Some of them are like a mix of Thomist and Scotist, like Gisbertus Vucius, however you pronounce his name. But I'm pretty sure most of the Scottish Covenanters are Scotist, and that does make perfect sense, because John Duns Scotus, the Scotus in his name means Scotland. It's because he was from Scotland, so it would make sense that the Scottish Presbyterians have more of a Scotist influence. And also, even though John Knox, who's like the founder of Scottish Presbyterianism, even though he wasn't really a scholastic and didn't use precise scholastic terminology, if you read his writings on predestination and his rationale behind predestination, he does sound a lot more Scotist. I'm assuming most of you don't know the distinctions between Thomism and Scotism, and let me put it this way. Scotism emphasizes the freedom of God more, and Thomism emphasizes, like, the intellect of God more. So a Thomist would say, oh, God did this because X, Y, and Z, whereas a Scotist would say, God did this simply because he's God and it's his good pleasure to do whatever he wants. I'm vastly oversimplifying it, but that is the tendency that you see between Thomists and Scotists. So, how does that actually apply to our theology, like of predestination? Well, when John Knox is defending a Calvinistic view of predestination in his writing on predestination, he says, God predestined whosoever he will, whosoever he did. And if you ask why he did, thou seekest a matter more great and more high than God's will itself, which cannot be found. Now, I don't think he's really thinking through all the scholastic distinctions here. Like I said, he's not exactly a scholastic theologian, John Knox, but that tendency, I think it's just probably in the Scottish air, is very voluntarist, a big emphasis on the freedom of God. So that's another sense in which I would say Presbyterians are more, Scotistic in their theology, even though they probably spend a bit less time thinking about abstract theology than the Dutch Reformed. So I would say the difference between Reformed in a general sense and Presbyterian is that Reformed is the abstract theological element of it, and Presbyterian is the way in which we actually put it into practice. Yeah, so Reformed refers to the abstract element of the theology. Presbyterian refers to the actual praxis of the theology, us actually putting into practice the things that we believe. And here's a brief criticism of Congregationalism and Episcopalianism, the two main alternatives. I think Presbyterian practice is most consistent with Reformed theology in the abstract sense, because Reformed theology, more than anything else, emphasizes human sin and the severity of human sin. Because of that, we don't want to put too much authority in the hands of bishops, because if we do that, we know that the human heart is a factory of idols. If we put too much power in the hands of individuals, they will tend towards idolatry. And that is why, even though the Episcopal Anglicans started out being very Reformed, they always drift back towards Catholicism, because I think the episcopal government structure is fundamentally consistent with Roman Catholicism, where there's too much of a conflation between the kingdom of God and the institutional church. I don't think we should separate the kingdom of God and the institutional church too much either, like the Congregationalists do. I think Presbyterianism is the perfect balance. But if you give too much power to the church as an institution, then it is a lot more prone to corruption and idolatry. Now, in terms of like modern liberalism, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, and Congregationalists are all kind of in the same boat there. Nobody's really innocent. But in terms of staying true to the principles of Reformed theology, Presbyterians have been way more faithful to those principles than Episcopalians. Even though the Episcopalians were originally Reformed, they keep reintroducing Roman Catholic practices, and in many cases, eventually Roman Catholic theology too. Like, traditionally, both Presbyterians and Anglicans held to double predestination, but it's very rare to find Anglicans today who will still hold to double predestination. So I think we were sort of vindicated in that Presbyterian government is most consistent with Reformed theology. Now, what about Congregationalism? Well, because we believe in sin, we don't want too much power from above. We also don't want too much power from below. If we give people too much freedom, then they could go whichever way they want, and there's not much accountability that would be stopping them. And because of that, Congregationalism has almost gone extinct today. Congregationalism has almost entirely evolved either into liberal Unitarian Universalism or just evolved into Baptists. There are, historic Congregationalist churches, like the CCCC denomination. I think it's like the Conservative Congregationalist Christian Conference or something like that. There are traditional Congregationalists who hold to like the Savoy Declaration and the Puritan heritage, but they are so rare, and they didn't used to be rare. Like, Congregationalists were the majority in many parts of America. It was like the state religion of Massachusetts for a long time. But now they are just so rare, and I think the absence of any overarching hierarchy is kind of the reason for that. And the ones who didn't go liberal sort of evolved into Baptists. And a lot of the churches in the CCCC, the denomination, the Conservative Congregationalist denomination, literally are Baptist, are Credo Baptist, and they're just in fellowship with those other Congregationalists. So what I think is that Episcopalianism, or even Reformed Episcopalianism, is Reformed theology, but with Roman Catholic ecclesiology. And then Congregationalism is Reformed theology, but with Anabaptist ecclesiology. Because the idea that the local church should be independent, that's not a traditional Protestant view, not a traditional Reformed view or Protestant view at all. It's a Anabaptist, it's a Baptist view. So I think that's why, of all these three government structures, Episcopalian, Congregationalist, and Presbyterian, Presbyterians have held most true to Reformed theology. There's tons and tons of Episcopal denominations. I'm using Episcopal in the lowercase e. There's tons of denominations that hold to Episcopal hierarchy that are no longer Calvinist. And there's tons of denominations that hold to Congregationalist hierarchy, like Baptists, that are no longer Calvinist. But Presbyterians, at least confessional Presbyterians, are the ones that stayed true to Reformed theology. So that's why I say the Reformed refers to our abstract, theology, and the Presbyterian part refers to how we put it into practice. But I think that the Presbyterian form of government is the most consistent way to put it into practice. And the reason I describe myself as specifically Presbyterian and not just Reformed, even though I am Reformed, is because we don't live in a world of ideas. We live in a world of real people and real communities. And I think an idea is almost useless if you don't put it into practice. So yeah, Reformed theology is great in the abstract, but if you're not actually part of a real Reformed church, you're not really Reformed. So the reason I call myself Presbyterian is because Presbyterianism is how I think Reformed theology has been best applied in the real world. So guys, thank you for watching. I'm going to speed this up while I do more work on my house here, and God bless.